Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here today. This is home for me, although I moved away some number of years ago. This topic of sustainability in buildings is a very large topic. I'm going to go pretty fast, but there's a lot to cover. Before I do that, I want to start with this very cliche these days image for a sustainability conference. But I think most of us in this audience are old enough to recognize how significant this image was to our concept of our reality here on this planet and how it sort of shrank our concept of the Earth. And even so, when you get on a plane to fly to Europe or South America or whatever, it still seems like a very large planet. And so I'd like to share with you an image that maybe helps bring it a little closer to home in terms of our impact. Everybody knows that the surface of the Earth is the livable part of the Earth. The center of the Earth doesn't really help us much except by its very existence. And this image, which I can't even credit, thanks to the anonymity of the internet, is a very powerful explanation of really how critical it is that we pay attention to the thin film of the biosphere that we live in. This on the left is a diagram or a representation of all of the water on the Earth if it were in a sphere instead of distributed across the surface of the planet. And you realize that we think of the oceans as vast and limitless, but in fact they're really not as large as that, and the actual volume of the ocean is very small. And this over here is a representation of the atmosphere condensed in a similar fashion. Let's assume that's at sea level, just for the sake of discussion. But again, when we think about how far away China is and their carbon impact and our own, which is equal, it's going into really a much smaller size volume than we think about when we think about the entire planet. So with that, I'm going to just tell you a little story that I thought of last night that somehow seemed appropriate. I'm going to come back in scale, obviously, to the built environment. And there's a very great deal of topics in green buildings that I could share with you. I don't really have time for that, and I'm used to talking to audiences of architects and engineers who I can beat on aggressively on changing their habits. And this is a much broader audience, and so I'm hoping that I can get the message right. But I had to come up with a few things to talk about, and it reminded me of a skit that I saw once from Monty Python. I think it was in The Life of Brian. Moses comes down from the mountain, and he's juggling 3 stone tablets, and it's very hard for him to carry. And just as he's starting to talk, he drops one. He says, "My people, I bring you these 15 crash, shatter, 10 commandments." And it makes me think that on the lost tablet were probably things like, "Thou shalt not foul thy neighbor's well. Thou shalt respect the birds and the beasts. Thou shalt honor the Lord's bounty." Think if we had that as part of our cultural heritage in the 10 commandments or the 15 commandments, it'd be a very different place. So let's move on to buildings. I mentioned that I've distilled my message into 6 points. Don't write them down here because I'm going to come back to them. So let's start first with green buildings matter. They really do matter. It's really making a big difference. In this picture, this is a picture of part of Seattle, the Lake Union area. There are at least 15 LEED green buildings that I can name in this image. Seattle's been very aggressive on green building and sustainability. And the reason it matters, I'm going to give you a little context, and the speaker yesterday talked about building energy use. And you've seen numbers for building energy use that range from 40% to about 50% of our U.S. energy use goes into buildings. And it sort of depends on where you measure it, whether you measure it at the meter, whether you count the power plants, and how you allocate transportation impacts of building distribution. But it's a very, very big part of our energy equation in this country. Everybody thinks it's all about transportation, but it's really not. It's really about power generation. And of course, most power that we generate goes to buildings. So likewise, since our power is very dirty and mostly coal-based or significantly coal-based, that means that the carbon impact of buildings is much higher, actually, than the carbon impact of our transportation sector or the carbon impact of our industrial sector. So when we talk about climate change and carbon reduction for the U.S., it really matters that we get the building sector right. So how do buildings impact carbon over their life? If you take a typical office building, say, with typical patterns of commuting and energy use of the building and so on and so forth over a 20-year life, what you see is that the largest impact on carbon has to do with operating the building. That's the energy used in operating the building day after day, keep the lights on, keep the systems running. A significant chunk is transportation energy, and that's again based on average American commuting habits, how far you have to drive every day, et cetera, et cetera. And this is commercial buildings, okay? Residential is different, and you have to decide whether you allocate transportation impacts to sprawl in residential sector or location of commercial buildings. It's a very complicated issue, but it is very, very important to understand that the magnitude of impact from buildings is their operation. So just to follow up on the sprawl issue a little bit, we talk about carbon impact and density, and this is a really great representation of Los Angeles area. And what you see here is that in the denser areas of Los Angeles, the amount of greenhouse gas emission is very high in the cities. And if that's the only thing you look at, you think that we have a problem because there's so much carbon coming out of LA. But if you look at the bottom, this is tons of carbon per household, and what you see is that the main impact is from the sprawl, not from the density. This is a much bigger problem than if we have good density. New York City has the lowest carbon intensity per occupant of any city in the country, of course. And you can see that play out in our development patterns, the way we choose to develop our buildings. Here's electricity intensity and greenhouse gas intensity of 3 different development patterns, from single family subdivision development to multifamily density. And you can see that in all cases, this is a much more efficient development pattern in terms of energy and greenhouse gas emissions. And likewise, specifically on energy, you can see transportation and home energy impacts of different development patterns from sprawl, which is, of course, what we mostly have in the West, green sprawl, where we're actually doing green buildings but still developing in a very poor land use pattern. Urban is still better, you know, even if the buildings are just standard construction, not green buildings, the fact that it's urban makes more of a difference than the fact that it's green in a subdivision. And then, of course, the best of all worlds is well thought out subdivisions with density and green building. And so these issues have led to a recognition of our climate impact of buildings. And Ed Masria, an architect who was a solar architect 30 years ago, is famous for that. But he was sort of in a great place to come up with what's called the 2030 Challenge. How many of you guys have heard of the 2030 Challenge? About half, that's great. In the building community, it's a very big deal. All the national building organizations, the AIA, the Engineering Society, ASHRAE, the U.S. Green Building Council, the U.S. Conference of Mayors has signed on to this more or less unanimously. Your city is part of this, has committed to this, and a number of states and the federal government is trying to get there. And what it says is that by 2030, all the buildings we build will be net zero energy users. That is, they will produce as much energy as they use on a net annual basis, which is a very tall order. And there's some interim steps, including 2010, this year, where all new buildings are supposed to be 50% more efficient than buildings at the turn of the century. And I will tell you right now that we have a long way to go to get there. On the other hand, my second point is that the market is changing very rapidly. It's amazing in the past 5 to 8 years how different the building industry is than it was. And we've got a long ways to go, but the change has been phenomenal. I mean, I've been consulting on buildings for about 20 years, and the last 5 years, 4 years, have been totally different from the 15 years before that, totally. The whole industry is talking about this, and we're making huge strides towards green building. And this is an industry that's very slow to change. So here's a quotation that sounds like a very progressive corporate quotation if you read through it. I'll read it to you. Our company will run on 100% renewable fuels, create zero waste, and sell an increasing number of sustainable products. So obviously, since they're selling products, you can imagine that it's a retailer, but who would predict that this is, in fact, Walmart? And being the cynic that I am, I sort of figured that Walmart got into this as a way to greenwash their really poor record with the public on employee rights and urban impacts, et cetera, et cetera. And that may be true, but the fact of the matter is that they very quickly got very serious about this. And they're a very large organization, and they've had a huge impact in the industry. And they're actually leaders in this field now. Amazing to me, but I absolutely have to admit that they are making a huge difference. And if they are doing it, you can believe that there's a whole bunch of other companies that are also recognizing that it makes business sense, because that's why Walmart, once they started down this path, they did, they ran the numbers very carefully, and they became completely convinced that this was the right answer for them. So there's been a number of studies suggesting that LEED buildings, which are green buildings rated by the U.S. Green Building Council, and Energy Star buildings, which are rated by the EPA for a building operation, command higher rents, have lower vacancy rates, and sell for higher prices. This study's been repeated 3 or 4 times in the past 5 years on large scale by multiple organizations. It's pretty much fully vetted in the industry now. And that means that all the big players in real estate and development are completely paying attention to this, because those kinds of margins are very significant to them. And this is just one example. The bigger piece that's harder to prove and yet much more significant is the impact of good building design, green building. We try to associate them on productivity. And there's a bunch of things to keep in mind on productivity when we talk about green buildings. This is an example from a building in Seattle that actually tracked this. And you can see these metrics represent a really important impact that, if you can attribute this to your building, are really substantial. So they've had an increase in revenue per person, billable revenue per person, probably because the people are happy there and spend more time there instead of out down the street at the coffee shop. The second largest tenant tracked its sick days and had a 30% decrease after they moved into this building, this green building. It was highly leased in a tough market. Lease rates are among the highest in the city, and one of the big client tenants considers it a key recruiting tool, that they can bring people in and show them what a wonderful space they're in. So this is really, there's a lot of studies of productivity in buildings. It's very difficult to directly pin down, so every bit of this tends to be anecdotal, but so significant that it can make a total difference in the bottom line for any of these companies. This is an example of data from a recent study by C.B. Richard Ellis, which is one of the biggest building managers in the country, did a study of all of their building stock, comparing their green buildings to their non-green buildings. And this, nearly half of the tenants in the green buildings reported a reduced annual sick days for employees. And if you think about it, just to give you an idea, 2 or 3 sick days of an employee is the same as the total annual operating cost of the building for that employee, for their space, their share of building energy. Probably even less, more like 2 days or 1 day is all the energy use of the year. So if you can affect the way the employees interact with your building, that's way better even than the building being efficient. And I don't know about this 10% more sick. It implies that we don't always get it right, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. In schools, the numbers are very significant also, and schools are the perfect client for green buildings. They're going to be there for the long term. It totally matters to them how the building performs, and they're paying for everything at the beginning. They're going to have to face the consequences of every decision they make in terms of long-term operation, because they're going to continue to own the building. Not like developers that are in it for 5 years, and anything that's got a 6-year payback they walk away from, right? These guys are in it for the long haul. So there's been tons of studies, of course, of what it is about. I'll get there. Tons of studies about how student performance is affected by teaching strategies, curriculum, environment, et cetera, and one study that was commissioned that was very interesting looked at all of the studies that had been done to try and correlate what are the main factors related to buildings that affect student performance. And the 4 main factors were comfort, are the students comfortable with respect to temperature, IAQ, indoor air quality, right, is the air clean and good to breathe, lighting, no surprise there, and acoustics. Those are the top 4, and those are all things that we consider to be part of a good green building strategy. So if you think about how this plays out, and there's hundreds of studies of various different aspects of this, for a school district, this can mean higher test scores, and there's studies that demonstrate that, reduced absenteeism if the air quality is better, they get sick less often. Reduced health risk, of course, if you're keeping the air clean and the building clean. Reduced stress, it turns out, if there's noise or people can't hear or the building's unpleasant, that kids are more stressed. Staff turnover is reduced if they like their building, and that is a huge cost for districts. And it turns out that if you look at test score relationship to teacher experience, the test scores go up with more teacher experience. So if you can hold on to the experienced teachers better with your buildings, you have better test scores as well. And then that's related to the turnover, of course. So a question you hear all the time, do green buildings cost more? And the answer is maybe. And at first the answer for fresh teams is yes, because you have to learn how to do it. You have to learn how to deliver green buildings effectively, and it costs more to do in the first place. However, over time, as you get experienced at delivering green buildings, the answer is no. And this is the data from a very large study of green building costs from Davis Langdon, who is I think they're the biggest cost estimating consulting firm in the country. So when you design and build a building, you get a cost estimate to make sure you're on budget, and these guys are the biggest provider of that. So they have tons and tons of data, and they went through their archives of their data for the last number of years to look at the cost of green buildings relative to other buildings throughout various different categories. And what you see is, if this is cost on this axis, you can see the colored bars are various different levels of LEED achievement, silver, gold, platinum, etc., relative to the gray bars, which is just other buildings. And what you see is that the cost of green buildings is completely distributed within the mix. And what their conclusion is, there are two conclusions. First, that project teams that don't understand green very well consider it an added feature, and they add the features later, and it's basically adding cost to the project. Project teams that understand it integrate it effectively at the beginning, and for those teams, the programmatic decisions, like what kind of marble you use in the lobby, are going to have a greater impact on cost than the green features do. Okay? And that's aside from the question of whether the building is more energy efficient and therefore pays for itself more quickly over time. So the third takeaway, is that even though the industry is changing and changing fast, we're not making nearly enough progress. And this little box, this series of boxes, represent a number of different definitions of green buildings. So this little small black square in the bottom is the buildings that achieve net zero energy use right now. There's about 10 of them in this country that are operating at a net annual zero energy use because they're very efficient and they have PV, photovoltaic arrays, generating power, et cetera, et cetera. So they're achieving about a net zero, which is what we want all our buildings to do by 2030. This red square next to it is all the buildings that are about 50% more efficient, or that meet today's criteria for the 2030 challenge, but they're basically using half as much energy as typical buildings. And then this blue is all LEED buildings, and you'll notice that the buildings that are using half as much energy or twice as efficient is a subset of all LEED buildings, and that's true. And then this yellow represents, say, all Energy Star buildings. That's all the buildings that have signed up with the Energy Star program to get a rating where they're performing in the top 25% of buildings in the US, so the top quartile. And this, until a year and a half ago, was the number of commercial buildings that we deliver every year in this country, which represents about 2% of our building stock. So if you take this annual number and squeeze everything down so that this annual number is about here, shrink these squares accordingly, you'll realize that we are just getting started on this. Okay? Even though we're demonstrating commitment and that we know how to do it, we're still just getting started. So here's a thing that you might have heard about that is very important to understand, and that is that the green label, whether it's an official LEED rating or an unofficial, we built a green building, aren't we great, does not guarantee performance. And there is absolutely an element of what we call greenwash to green building. There are some companies that are doing green building cynically or on the cheap, and they're just trying to get an overlay of respectability out of it because it is very respectable. But that is not by any means the definition of the market. There's a lot of people completely committed to this really aggressively. But even those people, the fact that they're designing and building green buildings does not mean that the buildings are performing the way they expect. And there's a number of issues that drive this that I want to talk about. So my firm, me and a coworker actually, did a study about 2 years ago, of the actual energy performance of buildings that had been rated as LEED buildings. And this is the data. On this axis is energy use, and these are all the buildings in our study. And you can see there's quite a range, and this is a subset of buildings that are defined as typical energy users. This doesn't include medical, lab, et cetera buildings, which use way, way more energy. The point is that energy use in buildings is highly variable in all buildings. It's highly variable in every building in this city. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But what you see is that the LEED buildings sort of ramp, or some of them are performing very well. This black line here is average U.S. building energy use. So most of the LEED buildings are below, and some are well below average energy use, some are above. And that's just the way it plays out. And if you think about it, and this is a really important thing to understand, you can design two buildings, identical buildings, in an office park, say. And let's say you're targeting 30% beyond code, which really has no meaning, but let's just use that as an example. In one building, a medium-sized nonprofit moves in. They work 4.5 days a week, 9 to 5, doing what they do. They're very conscientious about turning off their computers, turning off their lights, et cetera, et cetera. They have a good maintenance contract on the building, and they can use, say, about this much energy. The identical building, like they built the same building twice from the same set of plans, same design specs, let's say a small startup internet company moves in. They bring in a big honkin' set of servers that they plug in. All their machines, they have 3 machines per desk running all night. There's people there day and night, day and night. That building, same identical building, could use easily 3 times as much energy as the other one, okay? And that has nothing to do with the design. So we'll come back to that. This is a slide that I absolutely love because it's so telling for the building industry. This is actually about cars, and I actually use the car analogy a number of times. So this data shows, and sorry, it's pretty data intensive, but here's miles per gallon. This purple line is miles per gallon between 1981 and 2006 for the US fleet, okay? So the miles per gallon didn't go up very much. We all know that, right? And we haven't been very strict on that. However, during that period, the percent of cars with manual transmissions has dropped precipitously. Well, manual transmissions are more efficient, more fuel efficient than automatic transmissions. The time off the line has dropped substantially, meaning the cars have more muscle. They're more muscle cars. They have a lot more power. And the weight of the cars, of course, no surprise, has gone up pretty substantially as well. So even during all these big performance changes, the miles per gallon stayed relatively constant. If you look at this side, here's that same purple data line here, relatively constant miles per gallon. And here's what would have happened to fuel efficiency if the characteristics of weight, power, and percent manual transmission had remained constant. So it's not that we haven't learned how to make our cars more efficient, it's that we've chosen not to. And the same is true in buildings. So R value, in case you don't know, refers to the level of insulation in a building. So higher is better. So this building here is better insulated than this one, and this is a natural progression. We've learned the importance of insulating our buildings against the cold. However, we don't necessarily do it. Here's glass condos. You see them everywhere. They have terrible, terrible thermal performance, and yet this is what we build. We know better. We could build very efficient housing. We choose not to, okay? This is another slide from data from the EPA. And there's this whole concept in green building that technology is what's going to give us the efficiency we need for building. So here's a list of features that are considered to be energy efficiency features in a building. Occupancy sensors to turn off the lights when you're not there. VSD is variable speed drives. Energy audit means somebody's actually paying attention, going into the building to try and figure out whether it's working or not. Economizer means that you don't have to turn on the air conditioning if it's cool outside, you just bring in outside air. Seems like a no-brainer, right? And variable air volume, just so that there's no terms up here you haven't heard. So if you look at the data from a database of national building stock, and CBEX, which you see a couple times, means it's basically Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey. Every 3 years, the feds do this pretty significant survey of building performance, and the data is very useful in the building industry when we talk about performance. So if you look at the percent of buildings that have these features, that's the average, okay? And not surprisingly, the buildings that are Energy Star rated, meaning the best 25% of the building stock, are much more likely to have these efficiency features than average. However, the lowest 25% of our building stock is also more likely to have these features. So what does that mean? Well, it means the feature's not working right. And that's typical, that even though we put all these nice bells and whistles on our buildings, no one ever makes sure they work. And that's totally typical in our building stock because there's really not a very good accountability loop back to building operation, which I'll talk about more. So, briefly, another feature of green buildings that we'd like to think about is climate responsive design. That is, the building shell envelope characteristics respond to different climates. And you see it, you know, this is a classic example, the Pueblo cultures of southern Utah and Arizona, et cetera. You know, they built in these beautiful overhangs. They built massive buildings. They get sun in the winter. They get shade in the summer. You know, they did a great job with the resources they had. I don't necessarily argue that it was really comfortable in there in the dead of winter, but it was better than if you hadn't built in there, right? So they're responding to the climate. Likewise, long ago, we learned that if you build a greenhouse, you're going to capture the sun's energy, you're going to have more intensive heat in the winter, you can grow crops for a longer period, you can roast your occupants if you do it wrong. And that's the biosphere, by the way, which is another favorite story of mine. So here's two cities. Anybody recognize this one? Boise. How about this one? So here's my little cue here. You look at the buildings, you think, okay, this is Boise. It's a climate much like Salt Lake. They get winter, they get summer, they get fall. And maybe there's some cue in building design that suggests that these buildings belong here and these buildings belong here. But I would argue that there is no such cue. And this is Honolulu, right? So we're building the same exact building here as we are here, and then just dealing with it with bigger mechanical systems or whatever, right? So we're totally missing the climate cues that we could use to make our buildings more efficient. And this is a picture I pulled off the internet recently. And there are climate cues here. Where would you think that this building would be appropriate? I would argue nowhere. Glass building always generates additional loads. Glass is very inefficient thermally, so you lose more heat than you gain. Even as a solar building, if you have too much of it, it's going to have a greenhouse implication, gathering sun, heating up the occupants. This is the design for the new embassy in London. Very current, big name architect so-and-so, SFA, some fancy architect, whatever. Okay, so moving on, the next lesson. Buildings don't work by themselves, okay? There's plenty of things that the design community needs to deliver on, and I would argue that there's not good feedback to them. Very few architects know how their buildings actually work. There's no mechanism for that. There's no way to know, right? We talk about a code building. The standard way we talk about building performance is this building is 30% better than code, or 40% better than code, or whatever. The example I gave you of the two office buildings, both those buildings could be 30% better than code. One's working great, the other uses 3 times as much energy. They're both 30% better than code. Okay, so it's not just about this relative performance compared to a code, which the codes are kind of squirrely anyway. This picture, by the way, is one of the net zero buildings that are actually operational now. This building is in California. It's a small design firm, electrical engineering firm, and they are the occupant. And it was this terrible looking strip mall building, tilt-up concrete, looked awful. I should have showed you the before and after picture. But this is one of the best buildings in the country, by far, okay? And part of the reason it does so well is because the occupants are aggressive about the way they behave in the building. They built it. They wanted to see if they could design a net zero building for themselves. They track every single load, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just take a step away here. Anybody here drive a Hummer? I've never been able to get someone to raise their hand with that question. So when we look at these cars, we know, everybody here knows, you know this Prius is highly efficient. This is highly inefficient. And the metric we use is miles per gallon. Everybody, who here knows what kind of mileage they get in their car? Anybody not? Okay. So when we talk about performance feedback for our cars, we all know relatively how well our cars do. How many of you know relatively how well your building does, or your home? Either one. 2, 3, 4 people. Okay. Totally different. And you guys are more likely to know than the general public because you're actually paying attention to this kind of stuff. So we totally don't have feedback on building performance. And by the way, you know, GM was trying to sell the Hummer brand to China and some company in China, and the Chinese government decided that building gas hogs like this was gratuitous and not in keeping with their climate policies. And we talk about them being the climate problem, right? It's amazing to me. So I said that we don't really know how good our buildings are. Looking at this, you'd have no way of knowing which of these buildings are the good performers or the poor performance or whatever. These actually are all buildings that are, well, no, excuse me. These two are very good performers. This one, we have no idea. It was designed to be a very green building. It's one of the greenest buildings in the West. It's a platinum LEED building in Las Vegas. Wonderful, wonderful project, the Las Vegas Springs Preserve, or Desert Springs Preserve. If you get a chance, if you're going to Vegas, if you're forced to go to Vegas, go see this project because it's spectacular. They reclaim all their water. They have all these green features, but energy, not so good. At least that's my suspicion. And I was partly culpable. So if you get in a car, you look at your dashboard, you know pretty much what any particular data point on this picture is. There's 16 real-time data points right here, immediately available to you when you get in this car. If you're going to buy a car, you can go pick up a magazine and compare different vehicle performance, technical characteristics, occupant features, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is just from Motor Trend magazine, right? All this data is available to you as a consumer of a car. If you're a consumer of a building, you have almost nothing. And how many of you think that turning this actually changes any aspect of building performance? So what that brings me to is the important recognition for all of us that it's not just the way buildings are designed, okay? It is totally not. It is about how they are operated and how they are tenanted. And so you can sort of break it up into the design component, which when we talk about green design, we think it's all the architect and engineer's problem to deliver this building, and it is not. Okay, so they're responsible for layout, integration, installation, components and features. Those things matter, they totally do. However, if you don't maintain the building, staff it, control it effectively, maintain it over time, and go back in periodically to make sure systems are working because they all break, guaranteed over time, then you're going to lose this whole section of building operation. And likewise, the tenant habits, you know, do the lights stay on all night? Do the computers stay on all night? And the classic thing, especially in institutions with computers, is that the IT guys want to be able to turn your computer or to get into your computer in the middle of the night for any reason at any time to do their upgrades or whatever they do. That is such a huge energy user. It's just amazing. How often do you think those guys are up in the night, really? So there's great systems for managing that. One other little tidbit I'll throw out there. Paul Torsolini is a leading researcher at the National Renewable Energy Lab, and he just did a back-of-the-envelope calculation on energy use for home wireless servers. We all have them, or I certainly do, the little blue box, the flashing lights. You leave it on so you can walk downstairs with your laptop or whatever. It takes an entire coal plant to fire all the residential wireless boxes in this country. One coal plant to fire those. Just think about that for just a minute. When you think about your house, that is not a load you really consider, okay? And that's a big problem that we have to think about in the context of building operation. So, you know, this is there's hundreds of pictures like this, right? This is supposed to be the outside air intake, never been cleaned. You can imagine how hard the fan is working to get this much air in through this little hole. Classic example. This picture of Seattle at night. Do you think that there's people in all those buildings? No way. So just to give you an example of how occupant interaction with buildings can really play out, this is a picture of Juneau, Alaska. I don't know if you guys heard about this, but I think it was 2 years ago, maybe a year ago. The city is served by a hydropower, and one hydropower dam serves about, I might say up here, about 90% of their energy use comes through this transmission line that comes down from this one dam. And Juneau is a very isolated city if you've ever been there. And an avalanche took out the transmission line in May of 2008, I think it was. And immediately they lost, there it is, 80% of their transmission capacity. All of a sudden the city has 80% less electricity available to it than usual. 80% at a swoop, gone. So the electricity rates retroactively went, by the time they figured out they had what are we going to do, what are we going to do, take them about a week. They retroactively raised the rates about 450% for electricity from 12.5 cents to 56 cents a kilowatt hour. Okay? Huge jump in electrical prices. And electricity use, not surprisingly, they had to bring in generators, they had to replace the capacity, but because of the price signal, electricity use went down 30% in a week, and eventually 40% less electrical use. And the interesting thing is, here's the energy use over time, and you see the avalanche shuts off their power, they bring in their generators and they're fighting through it, and they restored the power about here, but it didn't really creep up very fast. Here's the same period of time the year before for this month. You can see this huge drop based on consumers making different choices about how they live because of the price of power or because of the community need, the recognition that we have a problem, we got to do something. But this is all behavior, right? So there's huge opportunity for us or you who are not in the design community, whatever, to actually have an impact on building energy use in this way. And I mentioned that there's not feedback to architects or tenants or whatever. This is a rating system that's coming into play. This is actually Great Britain's, and it's required in Great Britain as of last year. But the state of California is going to require a very similar thing. Washington, D.C., New York City, and Seattle all have ordinances requiring. In Seattle, for example, which I'm familiar with directly, as of next year, every commercial building over 50,000 square feet has to report its energy use publicly. And the year after that, every commercial building over 10,000 square feet has to report it publicly. And what you see on this graph, this is A is good, G is bad. I think in the US we just stop at F because that has more meaning. So this building was designed, modeled to be 30% better than code, say, which is this. But it's actually operating here. So it's not operating up to potential. So these are the two numbers that define the building stock. What was intended, what's really going on, and this basically sets the limit for how high this could go, but it's not there yet, right? So think about the implications if this were public information to any consumer who was renting a space, buying a space, building a space, and this kind of feedback, I believe, is going to completely change the market for buildings. So my last point is I want you to understand a little bit about renewable energy and the relationship of efficiency in buildings and renewable energy in buildings. So when we talk about designing a building, we can have there's a price and there's an efficiency for the building, right? If we graph those together, and you can build a kind of a cruddy building for a price and it's not going to be very efficient. And if you think harder about the way it's designed and make better choices about system sizing and efficiency, et cetera, you can actually make the building better moving this way without increasing its cost, with actually reducing the cost. Think, do we really need that much air conditioning? Let's just reduce that a little. We're going to do a more careful calculation of our loads. We're not going to make assumptions about the worst day in 1,000 years that the building's going to be fully occupied, so on and so forth. So there's opportunities to reduce cost, and then as you continue down the path to efficiency, it gets more and more expensive to get more and more efficient because you're having to really reach farther and farther into technological solutions, et cetera. So, of course, the operating cost decreases as the building gets more efficient. So when we start a design process, we have this baseline building, and a lot of the concept is that this is the best building. We've already designed the best building, and everything we do from here is going to add cost because we're going to add features. But in fact, there's a lot of room for optimizing the performance of the building, making better decisions with more careful thought, And what you see is that you can build for the same price. Is that level there? I can't see from here. For the same price, you could basically build a better building if you think harder about it. And that means that you've got this saving stream that you could actually finance more efficiency with and end up at the same place for cost, right? So this is the first step, is getting the efficiency at low cost, right? If we talk about putting photovoltaic generation on the buildings, well, that's got a pretty constant cost. You pay $1 for kilowatt for every bit you put on after the first, starting point, and it just goes up with capacity. And there is a point on this curve where it's less expensive to put on renewable power than to keep working on building efficiency. And that point's somewhere around 60 or 70% more efficient than standard practice, whatever that means. A lot of people talk about getting the efficiency simply by putting photovoltaics on the roof of your existing building, but the cost slope is the same. So to get to this same level, you have to spend a fortune on renewables. And that's why we talk about efficiency being more cost-effective than renewables, simply because of this relationship. And a study by the McKinsey Corporation recently suggested that energy efficiency is the most cost-effective new generation resource in the country. It's been suggested over and over and over again, and that we could reduce our building sector energy use by 25% and make a profit doing it in the next 15 or 20 years. Okay, so this is a huge opportunity. And I think that is all I have to say.